Good evening. Pardon me while I slightly adjust my green screen. There we go. Right, to my audience of one, namely Knight. So I am going to be reading, once again, continuing my epic marathon through the Giant Book of Vampires, published in approximately 1991. And I am sort of more than halfway through now, I think. I usually do 2 stories at a time. I will put the content warnings in the chat, because this one has some heck of content warnings. Actual literal Nazis. The only one with actual literal Nazis, I think it is in there. But yes, so that is the concern for the second story. I usually read the preamble as well, which gives you a bit of context on the authors. How are my sound levels? Am I audible? Is there a ridiculous amount of laptop noise in the background? No, I'm good. Well, I should adjust it in the YouTube video if there's an issue with it. That's fine. Okay. So the first story is Chastel by someone who rejoices in the name of Manley Wellman. Manley Wellman was one of the most prolific contributors to the pulp magazines of the 1930s and 40s, with stories appearing regularly in such titles as Weird Tales, wonder stories and astounding stories. During his long career, he wrote more than 75 books and over 200 short stories, ranging from comic books, mystery novels, juveniles, I don't know what a juvenile is, county histories, and works on the American Civil War. However, his first love was always the field of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Surely those are fields of, yeah. And he twice won the World Fantasy Award before his death in 1986. Some of Wellman's finest supernatural fiction can be found in the collections Who Fears the Devil, filmed in 1972, Where's Things Waiting, Lonely Vigils, and The Valley So Low. In Chastel, two of Wellman's best-known characters, Lee Cobbett and Judge Keith Hilary Pursuivant, joined forces to battle an age-old seductress. The author revealed that the novella was based on fact. The Connecticut setting for a vampire outbreak harks back to long ago Connecticut papers, which told of such things apparently happening. It's in the book cited here. Incidentally, both the poems I quote are actual ones. I've puzzled over the one from Grant's odd book, have never seen it anywhere else, and have never found anyone who has heard of it. Like Pursuivant here, I give myself to wonder if it isn't a fake antique, like Clark Saunders' better-known vampire poem to be found in Montague Summers. Another reference I don't know. There we go. I assume all these people are American, so I'm going to give them American accents. Then you won't let Count Dracula rest in his tomb? Inquired Lee Cobbett, his square face creasing with a grin. 5 of them sat in the parlour of Judge Keith Hilary Pursuivant's hotel suite on Central Park West. The judge lounged in an armchair, a wineglass in his big old hand. On this, his 87th birthday, his blue eyes were clear, penetrating. His once tawny hair and moustache had gone blizzard white, but both grew thick, and his square face showed rosy. In his tailored blue leisure suit, he still looked powerfully deep-chested and broad-shouldered. Blocky Lee Cobbett wore jacket and slacks almost as brown as his face. Next to him sat Laurel Parcher, small and young and cinnamon-haired. The others were Natty Phil Drum, the summer theatre producer, and Isabel Arrington, from a wire press service. She was blonde, expensively dressed. She smoked a dark cigarette with a white tip. Her pen scribbled swiftly. Dracula's as much alive as Sherlock Holmes, argued Drum. All the revivals of the play, all the films. Your musical should wake the dead anyway, said Cobbett, drinking. What's your main number, Phil? Garlic time? Gory, gory, hallelujah? Let's have Christian charity here, Lee. Pursuivant came to Drum's rescue. Anyway, Miss Arrington came to interview me. Pour her some wine. Let me try to answer her questions. I'm interested in Mr. Cobbett's remarks, said Isabel Arrington, her voice deliberately throaty. He's an authority on the supernatural. Well, perhaps, admitted Cobbett. And Miss Parcher has had some experiences, but Judge Pursuivant is the true authority, the author of Vampiricon. I've read it, in paperback, said Isabel Arrington. Phil, it mentions a vampire belief up in Connecticut, where you're having your show. Where's that town again? Deslow, he told her. We're making a wonderful old stone barn into a theatre. I've invited Lee and Miss Parcher to visit. She looked at Drum. Is Deslow a resort town? Not yet, but maybe the show will bring tourists. In Deslow, up to now, peace and quiet is the chief business. If you drop your shoe, everybody in town will think somebody's blowing the safe. Deslow's not far from Jewett City, observed Pursuivant. There were vampires there a century and a quarter ago. A family named Ray was afflicted, and to the east in Rhode Island there was a lively vampire folklore in recent years. Let's leave Rhode Island to H.P. Lovecraft's imitators, suggested Cobbett. What do you call your show, Phil? Oh no, he should have been from South, sorry. The Land Beyond the Forest, said Drum. We're casting it now, using locals in bit parts. But we have Gonda Chastel to play Dracula's countess. I never knew that Dracula had a countess, said Lauren Parcher. There was a stage star named... That's Pursuivant. There was a stage star named Chastel long ago when I was young, said Pursuivant. Just a one name. Chastel. Gonda's her daughter, and a year or so ago, Gonda came to live in Deslow, Drum told them. Her mother's buried there. Gonda has invested in our production. Is that why she has a part in it? Asked Isabel Arrington. She has a part in it because she's beautiful and gifted, replied Drum rather stuffily. Old people say she's the very picture of her mother. Speaking of pictures, here are some to prove it. He offered 2 glossy prints to Isabel Arrington, who murmured, "Very sweet," and passed them to Laurel Parcher. Cobbett leaned to see. One picture seemed copied from an older one. It showed a woman who stood with an unconscious stateliness in a gracefully draped robe, with a tiara binding her rich flow of dark hair. The other picture was of a woman in fashionable evening dress, her hair ordered in modern fashion, with face strikingly like that of the woman in the other photograph. "Oh, she's lovely," said Laurel. "Isn't she, Lee?" "Isn't she?" echoed Drum. "Magnificent," said Cobbett, handing the pictures to Persuivant, who studied them gravely. "Chastel was in Richmond just after the First World War," he said slowly. "A dazzling Lady Macbeth. I was in love with her. Everyone was." "Did you tell her you loved her?" said Laurel. "Yes, we had a supper together twice. And she went ahead with her tour, and I sailed to England and studied at Oxford. I never saw her again, but she's more or less why I never married." Silence a moment, then, "The Land Beyond the Forest," Laurel repeated. "Isn't there a book called that?" "There is indeed, my child," said the judge, "by Emily de Lazowska Gerard, about Transylvania, where Dracula came from." "That's why we used the title. That's what Transylvania means," put in Drum. "It's all right, as the book's out of copyright, but I'm surprised to find someone who's heard of it." "I'll protect your guilty secret, Phil," promised Isabel Arrington. "What's that over in your window, Judge?" Persuivant turned to look. "Whatever it is," he said, "it's not Peter Pan." Cobbett sprang up and ran towards the half-draped window. A silhouette with head and shoulders hung in the June night. He had a glimpse of a face rich-mouthed with bright eyes. Then it was gone. Laurel had hurried up behind him. He hoisted the window sash and leaned out. Nothing. The street was 14 stories down. The lights of moving cars crawled distantly. The wall below was course after course of dull brick, with recesses of other windows to right and left, below, above. Cobbett studied the wall, his hands braced on the sill. "Be careful, Lee," Laurel's voice besought him. He came back to face the others. "Nobody out there," he said evenly. "Nobody could be. It's just a wall. Nothing to hang to. Even that sin will be tricky to stand on." "But I saw something, and so did Judge Persuivant," said Isabel Arrington, the cigarette trembling in her fingers. "So did I," said Cobbett. "Didn't you, Laurel?" "Only a face." Isabel Arrington was calm again. "If it's a trick, Phil, you played a good one, but don't expect me to put it in my story." Drum shook his head nervously. "I didn't play any trick, I swear." "Don't try this on old friends," she jabbed at him. "First those pictures, then whatever was up against the glass. I'll use the pictures, but I won't write that weird vision presided over this birthday party." "How about a drink all round?" suggested Persuivant. He poured for them. Isabel Arrington wrote down answers to more questions, and then said she must go. Drum rose to escort her. "You'll be at Deslow tomorrow, Lee?" "Yes, and Laurel too. You said we could find quarters there." "The Maple Tree's a good auto court," said Drum. "I've already reserved cabins for the rest, 2 of you. Oh no, cute. I'm losing track of who's from where. "The Maple Tree's a good auto court," said Drum. "I've already reserved cabins for the 2 of you." "On the spur of the moment..." "Oh no, there. "On the spur of the moment," said Persuivant suddenly. "I think I'll come along, if there's space for me." "I'll check it out for you, Judge," said Drum. He departed with Isabel Arrington. Cobbett spoke to Persuivant. "Isn't that rather offhand? He has decided to come with us." "I was thinking about Chastel," Persuivant smiled gently. "About making a pilgrimage to her grave." "We'll drive up about 9 tomorrow morning." "I'll be ready, Lee." Cobbett and Laurel, too, went out. They walked down a flight of stairs to the floor below, where both their rooms were located. "Do you think Phil Drum rigged up that illusion for us?" asked Cobbett. "If he did, he used the face of that actress, Chastel." He glanced keenly at her. "You saw that?" "I thought I did, and so did you." They kissed goodnight at the door to her room. Persuivant was ready next morning when Cobbett knocked. He had only one suitcase and a thick brown-blotched Malacca cane, banded with silver below its curved handle. "I'm taking only a few necessaries," I'll buy socks and such things in Deslow if we stay more than a couple of days, he said. No, don't carry it for me. I'm quite capable. When they reached the hotel garage, Laurel was putting her luggage in the trunk of Cobbett's black sedan. Judge Persuivant declined the front seat beside Cobbett, held the door for Laurel to get in, and sat in the rear. They rolled out into the bright June sunlight. Cobbett drove them east on Interstate 95, mile after mile along the Connecticut shore, past service stations, markets, sandwich shops. Now and then they glimpsed Long Island Sound to the right. At toll gates, Cobbett threw quarters into hoppers and drove on. New Rochelle to Port Chester, Laurel half-chanted. Norwalk, Bridgeport, Stratford. Well, in 1851, Devil's Plague the Minister's Home, put in Persuivant. The names make a poem, said Laurel. You can get that effect by reading any timetable, said Cobbett. We missed a couple of good names, Mystic and Giant's Neck, though they ain't far off from our route. In Griswold, means Grey Woods, where the judge's book says Horace Ray was born. There's no Griswold on the Connecticut map anymore, said Judge. Vanished? Said Laurel. Maybe it appears just at a certain time of the day, along about sundown. She laughed, but the judge was grave. Here we'll pass by New Haven, he said. I was at Yale here 70 years ago. They rolled across the Connecticut River, between Old Saybrook and Old Lyme. Outside New London, Cobbett turned them north on State Highway 82, and near Jewett City took a two-lane road that brought them to Deslow not long after noon. There were pleasant clapboard cottages among elm trees and flower beds. Main Street had bright shops with, farther along, the belfry of a sturdy old church. Cobbett drove them to the sign saying Maple Tree Court. A row of cabins faced along a cement-floored colonnade, their fronts painted white with blue doors and window frames. In the office, Phil Drum stood at the desk, talking to the pump proprietress. Welcome home. Oh, that's Phil Drum. Welcome home, he greeted them. Judge, I was asking Mrs. Simpson here to reserve you a cabin. At the far end of the row, sir, the lady said. I'd have put you next to your new friends, but so many theatre folks have already moved in. She should have a Connecticut accent, and I don't know what a Connecticut accent sounds like. So there we go. Long ago I learned to be happy with any shelter, said the judge assured her. They saw Laurel to her cabin and put her suitcases inside, then walked to the father's cabin where the Persuivant would stay. Finally, Drum followed Cobbett to the space next to Laurel's. Inside, Cobbett produced a fifth of bourbon from his briefcase. Drum trotted away to fetch ice, and Persuivant came to join them. It's good of you to look after us, Cobbett said to Drum above his glass. Oh, I'll get my own back, Drum assured him. The judge and you distinguished folklore experts, I'll have you all in the papers. Whatever you like, said Cobbett. Let's have lunch, as soon as Laurel is freshened up. The four ate crab cakes and flounder at a little restaurant, while Drum talked about the land beyond the forest. He had signed the minor film star Caspar Merrick to play Dracula. He has a fine baritone singing voice, said Drum. He'll be at afternoon rehearsal. In gone to Chastel? Inquired Persuivant, buttering a roll. She'll be there tonight. Drum sounded happy about that. This afternoon's mostly for bits and chorus numbers. I'm directing as well as producing. They finished their lunch and Drum rose. If you're not tired, come and see our theatre. It was only a short walk through town to the converted barn. Cobbett judged it had been built in colonial times with a recent roof of composition tile, but with walls of stubborn brown-grey New England stone. Across a narrow side street stood the old white church with a hedge-bordered cemetery. Quaint, that old burying ground, commented Drum. Nobody's spaded under there now. There's a modern cemetery on the far side, but Chastel's tomb is there. Quite a picturesque one. I'd like to see it, said Persuivant, leaning on his silver-banded cane. The barn's interior was set with rows of folding chairs, enough for several hundred spectators. On a stage at the far end, workmen moved here and there under lights. Drum led his guests up steps at the side. High in the lofts, catwalk zigzag, and a dark curtain hung like a broad guillotine blade. Drum pointed out canvas flats, painted to resemble grim castle walls. Persuivant nodded and questioned. I'm no authority on what you might find in Transylvania, he said, but this looks convincing. A man walked from the wings towards them. Hello, Caspar, Drum greeted him. I want you to meet Judge Persuivant and Lee Cobbett, and Miss Laurel Parcher, of course. He gestured to the introductions. This is Mr. Caspar Merrick, our Count Dracula. Merrick was elegantly tall, handsome, with carefully groomed black hair. Sweepingly, he bowed above Laurel's hand and smiled at them all. Judge Pursuivant's writings I know, of course, he said richly. I read what I can about vampires, inasmuch as I'm to be one. Places for the delusion number, called a stage manager. Cobbett, Pursuivant and Laurel went down the steps and sat on chairs. 8 men and 8 girls hurried into view, dressed in knockabout summer clothes. Someone struck chords on a piano. Drum gestured importantly and the chorus sang. Merritt, coming downstage, took solo on a verse. All joined in the refrain. Then Drum made them sing it over again. After that, 2 comedians made much of confusing the words vampire and empire. Cobbett found it tedious. He excused himself to his companions and strolled out and across to the old tree-crowded churchyard. The gravestones bore interesting epitaphs, not only the familiar "Pause, O stranger passing by, as you are now, so once was I," and "A bird on earth, to bloom in heaven," but several of more originality. One bewailed a man who, since he had been lost at sea, could hardly have been there at all. Another bore, beneath a batwing face, the declaration, "Death pays all debts," and the date 1907, which Cobbett associated with a financial panic. Toward the centre of the graveyard, under a drooping willow, stood a shed-like structure of heavy granite blocks. Cobbett picked his way to the door of heavy grillwork, which was fastened with a rusty padlock the size of a sardine can. On the lintel were strongly carved letters. Chastel. Here then was the tomb of the stage beauty Pursuivant remembered. Pursuivant remembered so romantically. Sorry. Cobbett peered through the bars. It was murkily dusty in there. The floor was coarsely flagged, and among sooty shadows at the rear stood a sort of stone chest that must contain the body. Cobbett turned and went back to the theatre. Inside, piano music rang wildly, and the people of the chorus desperately rehearsed what must have been meant for a folk dance. "Oh, it's exciting," said Laurel as Cobbett sat down beside her. "Where have you been?" "Visiting the tomb of Chastel." "Chastel?" echoed Pursuivant. "I must see that too." Songs and dance ensembles went on. In the midst of them, a brisk reporter from Hartford appeared to interview Pursuivant and Cobbett. At last, Drum resoundingly dismissed the players on stage and joined his guests. "Hiya, Jem. Principals rehearse at 8 o'clock, he announced. Gunda Chastel will be here and she'll want to meet you. Could I count on you then?" "Count on me, at least," said Pursuivant. "Just now I feel like resting before dinner, and so I think does Laurel here." "Why don't we all meet for dinner at the place where we had lunch?" said Cobbett. "You come too, Phil." "Thanks, I have a date with some backers from New London." It was 5:30 when they went out. Cobbett went to his quarters, stretched out on the bed, and gave himself to thought. He hadn't come to Deslo because of this musical interpretation of the Dracula legend. Laurel had come because he was coming, and Pursuivant on a sudden impulse that might have been more than a wish to visit the grave of Chastel. But Cobbett was here because this, he knew, had been vampire country, maybe still was vampire country. He remembered the story in Pursuivant's book about vampires at Jewett City, as reported in the Norwich Courier for 1854. Horace Ray, from the now vanished town of Griswold, had died of a wasting disease. Thereafter his oldest son, then his second son, had also gone to their graves. When the third son sickened, friends and relatives dug up Horace Ray and the 2 dead brothers and burned the bodies in a roaring fire. The surviving son got well, and something like that had happened in Exeter near Providence in Rhode Island. Very well, why organise and present the Dracula musical here in Deslo, so near those places? Cobbett had met Phil Drum in the South the year before, knew him for a brilliant if erratic producer who relished tales of devils and the dead who walk by night. Drum might have known enough stage magic to have rigged that seeming appearance at Pursuivant's window in New York. That is, if indeed it was only a seeming appearance, not a real face. Might it have been real? A manifestation of the unreal? Cobbett had seen enough of what people dismissed as unreal, impossible, to wonder. A soft knock came at the door. It was Laurel. She wore green slacks, a green jacket, and she smiled, as always, at the sight of Cobbett's face. They sought Pursuivant's cabin. A note on the door said, "Meet me at the cafe." When they entered there, Pursuivant hailed them from the kitchen door. "Dinner's ready," he hailed them. "I've been supervising in person, and I paid well for the privilege." A waiter brought a laden tray. He arranged platters of red-drenched spaghetti and bowls of salad on the table. Pursuivant himself sprinkled Parmesan cheese. "No salt or pepper," he warned. "I seasoned it myself, and you can take my word, it's exactly right." Cobbett poured red wine into glasses. Laura took a forkful of spaghetti. Delicious, she cried. What's in it, Judge? Not only ground beef and tomatoes, and onion and garlic, replied Pursuivant. I added marjoram and green pepper and chili and thyme and bay leaf and oregano and parsley and a couple of other important ingredients. And I also minced in some Italian sausage. Cobbett, too, ate with enthusiastic appetite. I won't order any dessert, he declared. I want to keep the taste of this in my mouth. There's more in the kitchen for dessert if you want it, said the judge assured him. But here, I have a couple of keepsakes for you. He handed each of them a small silvery object. Cobbett examined his. It was smoothly wrapped in foil. He wondered if it was a nut meat. The hell is a nut meat? You have pockets, I perceive, the judge said. Put those into them, and don't open them, or my wish for you won't come true. When they had finished eating, a full moon had begun to rise in the darkening sky. They headed for the theatre. A number of visitors sat in the chairs, and the stage lights looked bright. Drum stood beside the piano, talking to two plump men in some business suits. As Pursuivant and the others came down the aisle, Drum eagerly beckoned them and introduced them to his companions, the financial backers with whom he had taken dinner. We're very much interested, said one. This vampire legend intrigues anyone if you forget that a vampire's motivation is simply nourishment. No, something more than that, offered Pursuivant. A social motivation. Social motivation? Repeated the other backer. A vampire wants company of its own kind. A victim infected becomes a vampire too, and an associate. Otherwise, the original vampire would be a disconsolate loner. There's a lot in what you say, said Drum, impressed. After that, there was financial talk, something in which Cobbett could not intelligently join. Then someone else approached, and both the backers stared. It was a tall, supremely graceful woman with red-lighted black hair and a bun at her nape, a woman of impressive figure and assurance. She wore a sweeping blue dress, fitted to her slim waist with a frill-edged neckline. Her arms were bare and white and sweetly turned, with jewelled bracelets on them. Drum almost ran to bring her close to the group. Gone to Chastel, he said, half prayerfully. Oh, thank you. The definition of nut meat apparently is the part of a nut that is inside the shell and can be eaten. Why you would wrap it in silver foil? I don't know. I mean, if you want, I can do the whole thing in Glaswegian, but it's not going to work for this this particular stream. There is a story later in the book, however, which would require me to do an Inverness accent, which I will have to practice before I do it, because it's very fluting, if memory serves. Where was I? The two backers stuttered admiringly at her. Pursuivant bowed and Laurel smiled. Gonda Chastel gave Cobbett her slim, cool hand. You know so much about this thing we're trying to do here, she said in a voice like cream. Yeah. Drum watched them. His face looked plaintive. Judge Pursuivant has taught me a lot, Miss Chastel, said Cobbett. He'll tell you that once he knew your mother. I remember her. Oh no. I remember her. Not very clearly, said Gonda Chastel. She died when I was just a little thing, 30 years ago. And I followed her here, and now I make my home here. You look very like her, said Pursuivant. I'm proud to be like my mother in any way, she smiled at them. She could be overwhelming, Cobbett told himself. And Miss Parcher, went on Gonda Chastel, turning towards Laurel. What a little presence she is. She should be in our show. I don't know what part, but she should. She smiled dazzlingly. I will settle on an accent for her eventually. Now then, Phil wants me on stage. Knock at the door, Number Gonda, said Drum. Gracefully she mounted the steps. The piano sounded, and she sang. It was the best song, felt Cobbett, as he had heard so far in the rehearsals. Are they seeking for a shelter from the night? Gonda Chastel sang richly. Caspar Merritt entered to join in a recitative. Then the chorus streamed on, singing somewhat shrilly. Pursuivant and Laurel had sat down. Cobbett strode back up the aisle and out under a moon that rained down silver-blue light. He found his way to the churchyard. The trees that had offered pleasant afternoon shade now made a dubious darkness. He walked underneath branches that seemed to lower like hovering wings as he approached the tomb structure at the centre. The bar door that had been massively locked now stood open. He peered into the gloom within. After a moment, he stepped across the threshold upon the flagged floor. He had to grope with one hand upon the rough wall. At last he almost stumbled upon the great stone chest at the rear. It too was flung open, its lid heaved back against the wall. There was, of course, complete darkness within it. He flicked on his cigar lighter. The flame showed him the inside of the stone coffer, solidly made and about 10 feet long. Its sides of grey marble were snugly fitted. Inside lay a coffin of rich dark wood with silver fittings, and here yet again was an open lid. Bending close to the smudged silk lining, Cobbett seemed to catch an odour of stuffy sharpness, like dried herbs. He snapped off his light and frowned in the dark. Then he groped back to the door, emerged into the open, and headed for the theatre again. "Mr. Cobbett," said the beautiful voice of Gonda Chastel. She stood at the graveyard's edge beside a sagging willow. She was almost as tall as he. Her eyes glowed in the moonlight. "You came to find the truth about my mother," she half accused. "I was bound to try," he replied, "ever since I saw a certain face at a certain window of a certain New York hotel." She stepped back from him. "You know that she's a vampire?" Cobbett finished for her. "Yes." "I beg you to be helpful, merciful." But there was no supplication in her voice. "I already realized it long ago. That's why I came to live in Little Deslo. I want to find a way to give her rest. Night after night, I wonder how." "I understand that," said Cobbett. Gonda Chastel breathed deeply. "You know all about these things. I think there's something about you that could daunt a vampire." "If so, I don't know what it is," said Cobbett truthfully. "Make me a solemn promise that you won't return to her tomb, that you won't tell others what you and I know about her. I want to think how we two together can do something for her." "If you wish, I'll say nothing," he promised. Her hand clutched his. "The cast took a 5-minute break. It must be time to go to work again," she said, suddenly bright. "Let's go back and help the thing along." They went. Inside, the performers were gathering on stage. Drum stared unhappily as Gonda Chastel and Cobbett came down the aisle. Cobbett sat with Laurel and Pursuivant and listened to the rehearsal. Adaptation from Bram Stoker's novel was free, to say the least. Dracula's eerie plottings were much hampered by his having a countess, a walking dead beauty who strove to become a spirit of good. There were some songs in interesting minor keys. There was a dance in which men and women leaped like kangaroos. Finally, Drum called a halt and the performers trooped wearily to the wings. Gonda Chastel lingered, talking to Laurel. "I wondered, dear, if you haven't had acting experience," she asked. "Only in school entertainments down south when I was little." "Phil," said Gonda Chastel, "Miss Parcher is a good type that has a good presence. There ought to be something for her in this show." You were very kind, but I'm afraid that's impossible," said Laurel, smiling. "You may change your mind, Mr. Parcher. Will you and your friends come to my house for a nightcap?" "Thank you," said Pursuivant. "We have some notes to make, but we may make them together." "Until tomorrow evening, then, Mr. Cobbett. We'll remember our agreement." She went away towards the back of the stage. Pursuivant and Laurel walked out. Drum hurried up the aisle and caught Cobbett's elbow. "I saw you," he said harshly. "Saw both of you as you came in." "And we saw you, Phil. What's this about?" "She likes you." It was half an accusation. "Fawns on you, almost." Cobbett grinned and twitched his arm free. "What's the matter, Phil? You in love with her?" "Yes, goddammit, I am. I'm in love with her. She knows it, but she won't let me come to her house. And you, the first time she meets you, she invites you." "Easy does it, Phil," said Cobbett. "If it'll do you any good, I'm in love with somebody else. And that takes just about all my spare time." He hurried out to overtake his companions. Pursuivant swung his cane almost jauntily as they returned to the moonlight to the auto court. "What notes are you talking about, Judge?" asked Cobbett. "I'll tell you my quarters. What do you think of the show?" "Perhaps they'll like it better if they've rehearsed more," said Laurel. "I don't follow it at present." "Here and there it strikes me as limp," added Cobbett. They sat down in the judge's cabin. He poured them drinks. "Now," he said, "there are certain things to recognize here. Things I'm more or less expected to find." "A mystery, Judge?" asked Laurel. "Not so much that, if I expected to find them. How far are we from Jewett City?" 12 or 15 miles as the crow flies," estimated Cobbett. "And Jewett City is where that vampire family, the Rays, lived and died. Died twice, you might say. nodded Pursuivant, stroking his white moustache. Back about a century and a quarter ago, and here's what might be a matter of Ray family history. I've been thinking about Chastel, whom I once greatly admired, about her full name. But she only had one name, didn't she? Asked Laurel. On the stage, she used one name, yes. So did Bernhardt. So did Deuce. So later did Garbo. But all of them had full names. Now, before we went to dinner, I made 2 telephone calls to theatrical historians I know, to learn Chastel's full name. And she had a full name? Prompted Cobbett. Indeed she did. Her full name was Chastel Ray. Cobbett and Laura looked at him in deep silence. Not apt to be just coincidence, elaborated Pursuivant. Now then, I gave you some keepsakes today. Here's mine, said Cobbett, pulling the foil-wrapped bit from his shirt pocket. And I have mine here, said Laurel, her hand at her throat. In a little locket I have on this chain. Keep it there, Pursuivant urged her. Wear it round your neck at all times. Lee, have yours always on your person. Those are garlic cloves, and you know what they're good for. You can also guess why I cut up a lot of garlic in our spaghetti for dinner. You think there's a vampire here? Offered Laurel. A specific vampire. The judge took a deep breath into his broad chest. Chastel. Chastel Ray. I believe it too, declared Cobbett tonelessly, and Laurel nodded. Cobbett looked at the watch on his wrist. It's past 1 in the morning, he said. Perhaps we'd all be better off if we had some sleep. They said their good nights, and Laurel and Cobbett walked to where their 2 doors stood side by side. Laurel put her key in the lock, but did not turn it at once. She peered across the moonlit street. Who's that over there? She whispered. Maybe I ought to say. What's that? Cobbett looked. Nothing. We're just nervous. Good night, dear. She went in and shut the door. Cobbett quickly crossed the street. Listen to the woman. She saw something. And you know there are vampires around, you silly sod. Mr. Cobbett, said the voice of Gonda Chastel. I wondered what you wanted so late at night. Oh no, he wasn't being an ignorant idiot. Okay, fair enough. He said, walking close to her. She had undone her dark hair and let it flow to her shoulders. She was, Cobbett thought, as beautiful a woman as he'd ever seen. I wanted to be sure about you, she said. That you'd respect your promise to me, not to go into the churchyard. I'll keep my promises, Miss Chastel. He felt a deep, hushed silence all around them. Not even the leaves rustled in the trees. I hoped you wouldn't venture even this far, she went on. You and your friends are new in town. You might tempt us specially. Her eyes burned at him. You know I don't mean that as a compliment. She turned to walk away. He fell in step beside her. But you're not afraid of her? He said. Of my own mother? She was a Ray, said Cobbett. Each Ray sapped the blood of his kinsman. Judge Pursuivant told me all about it. Again the gaze of her dark, brilliant eyes. Nothing like that has ever happened between my mother and me. She stopped, and so did he. Her slim, strong hand took him by the wrist. You're wise and brave, she said. I think you have come here for a good purpose, not just about the show. I try to have good purposes. The light of the moon soaked through the overhead branches as they walked on. Will you come to my house? She invited. I'll walk to the churchyard, replied Cobbett. I said I wouldn't go into it, but I can stand at the edge. Don't go in. I promised that I wouldn't, Miss Chastel. She walked back the way they had come. He followed the street on under silent elms until he reached the border of the churchyard. Moonlight flecked and splattered the tombstones. Deep shadows lay like pools. He had a sense of being watched from within. As he gazed, he saw movement among the graves. He could not define it, but it was there. One can always try to have a good purpose, Jem, yes. He glimpsed, or fancied he glimpsed, a head, indistinct in outline as though swathed in dark fabric. Then another. Another. They huddled in a group as though to gaze at him. I wish you'd go back to your quarters, said Gonda Chastel beside him. She had drifted after him, silent as a shadow herself. Miss Chastel, he said, tell me something if you can. Whatever happened to the town or village of Griswold? Griswold, she echoed. What's Griswold? That means Grey Woods. Your ancestor, or your relative, Horace Ray, came from Griswold to die in Jewett City, and I told you that I knew your mother was born a Ray. Her shining eyes seemed to flood upon him. I didn't know that, she said. He gazed into the churchyard at those hints of furtive movement. The hands of the dead reach out for the living, murmured Godner Chastel. Reach out for me? He asked. Perhaps for both of us. Just now we may be the only living souls awake in Deslo. She gazed at him again. But you're able to defend yourself somehow? What makes you think that? He inquired, aware of the clove of garlic in his shirt pocket. Because they, in the churchyard there, they watch, but they hold away from you. You don't invite them. Nor do you, apparently, said Cobbett. I hope you're not trying to make fun of me, she said, her voice barely audible. On my soul, I'm not. On your soul, she repeated. Good night, Mr. Cobbett. Again she moved away, tall and proud and graceful. He watched her out of sight, then he headed back towards the motor court. Nothing moved in the empty streets. Only one or two lights shone here and there in closed shops. He thought he heard a soft rustle behind him, but he did not look back. As he reached his own door, he heard Laurel scream behind hers. Judge Persuivant sat in his cubicle, his jacket off, studying a worn little brown book. Skinner said letters on the spine and Myths and Legends of Our Own Land. He had read the passage so often that he could almost repeat it from memory. To lay this monster, he must be taken up and burned. At least his heart must be, and he must be disinterred in the daytime when he is asleep and unaware. There were other ways, reflected Persuivant. It must be very late now. Rather, it must be very early. But he had no intention of going to sleep. Not when stirs of motion sounded outside, along the concrete walkway in front of his cabin. Did motion stand still, just beyond the door there? Persuivant's great veined hand touched the front of his shirt, beneath which the bag of garlic hung like an amulet. Garlic, was that enough? He himself was fond of garlic, judiciously employed in sauces and salads. But then he could see himself in the mirror of the bureau yonder, could see his broad old face with its white sweep of moustache, like a wreath of snow on the sill. It was a clear image of a face, not a calm face just then, but a determined one. Persuivant smiled at it, with a glimpse of even teeth that were still his own. He flicked up his shirt cuff and looked at his watch. 1:30, about. In June, even with daylight savings time, dawn would come early. Dawn sent vampires back to tombs that were their melancholy refuges, asleep and aware, as Skinner had specified. Putting the book aside, he poured himself a small drink of bourbon, dropped in cubes of ice and a trickle of water, and sipped. He had drunk several times during that day, when on most days he partook of only a single highball, by advice of his doctor. Just one spirit a day, to keep your liver healthy. But just now he was grateful for the pungent walnutty taste of the liquor. It was one of Earth's natural things, a good companion when not abused. From the table he took a folder of scribbled notes. He looked at jottings from the works of Montague Summers. These offer the proposition that a plague of vampires usually stemmed from a single source of infection, a king or queen vampire, whose feasts of blood drove victims to their graves to rise in their turn. If the original vampires were found and destroyed, the others relaxed to rest as normally dead bodies. Bram Stoker had followed the same gospel when he wrote Dracula, and doubtless Bram Stoker had known. Spirit taking the vampires away. Apparently Gowlick as well. And doubtless Persuivant looked at another page, this time a poem copied from James Grant's Curious Mysteries of All Nations. It was a ballad in archaic language that dealt with baleful happenings in the town of Pest. Budapest? It was the corpses that our churchyards filled, that did at midnight lumber upon our stairs. They sucked our blood, the gory banquet swilled, and harried every soul with hideous fears. Several verses down. They barred with bolts of iron the churchyard pale, to keep them out, but all this would not do. For when a dead man has learned to draw a nail, he can also burst an iron bolt in two. Many times Persuivant had tried to trace the author of that verse. He wondered if it was not something quaintly confected not long before 1880, when Grant published his work. At any rate, the judge felt that he knew what it meant, the experience that it remembered. He put aside the notes too, and picked up his spotted walking stick. Clamping the balance of it firmly in his left hand, he twisted the handle with his right and pulled. Out of the hollow shank slid a pale, bright blade, keen and lean and edged on both front and back. Persuivant permitted himself a smile above it. This was one of his most cherished possessions, this silver weapon said to have been forged 1,000 years ago by St. Dunstan. Bending, he spelled out the runic writing upon it. Sic periant omnes inimici tui, Domine. That was the end of the fiercely triumphant song of Deborah in the Book of Judges. So perish all thine enemies, O Lord. Whether the work of St. Dunstan or not, the metal was silver. The writing was a warrior's prayer. Silver and writing had proved their strength against evil in the past. Then outside, a loud tremulous cry of mortal terror. Persuivant sprang out of his chair on the instant. Blade in hand, he fairly ripped the door open and ran out. He saw Cobbett in front of Laurel's door, wrenching at the knob, and hurried there like a man half his age. "Open up, Laurel," he heard Cobbett call. "It's Lee out here." The door gave inward as Pursuivant reached it, and both he and Cobbett pressed into the lighted room. Laurel half crouched in the middle of the floor. Her trembling hand pointed to a rear window. She tried to come in," Laurel stammered. "There was nothing at that window," said Cobbett, but even as he spoke there was. A face, pale as tallow, crowded against the glass. They saw wide, staring eyes, a mouth that opened and squirmed. Teeth twinkled sharply. Cobbett started forwards, but Pursuivant caught him by the shoulder. "Let me," he said, advancing towards the window, the point of his blade lifted. The face of the window writhed convulsively as the silver weapons came against the pane with a clink. The mouth opened as though to shout, but no sound came. The face fell back and vanished from their sight. "I've seen that face before," said Cobbett hoarsely. "Yes," said Pursuivant, "at my hotel window, and since." He dropped the point of the blade to the floor. Outside came a whirring rush of sound, like feet, many of them. "We ought to wake up the people at the office," said Cobbett. "I doubt if anyone in this little town could be wakened," Pursuivant told him evenly. "I have it in mind that every living soul except the three of us is sound asleep. Entranced." "But out there," Laurel gestured to the door, where something seemed to be pressing. "I said, every living soul." Pursuivant looked from her to Cobbett. "Living," he repeated. He paced across the floor, and with his point scratched a perpendicular line upon it. Across this he carefully drove a horizontal line, making a cross. The pushing abruptly ceased. "There it is, at the window again," breathed Laurel. Pursuivant took long steps back to where the face hovered with black hair streaming about it. He scraped the glass with his silver blade up and down, then across, making lines upon it. The face drew away. He moved to mark similar crosses on the other windows. "You see," he said, quietly triumphant, "the force of old charms." He sat down in a chair heavily. His face was weary, but he looked at Laurel and smiled. "It might help if we managed to pity those poor things out there," he said. "Pity?" she almost cried out. "Yes," he said, and quoted, "Think how sad it must be to thirst always for a scorned elixir, the salt of quotidian blood." This author really likes quoting stuff. "I know that," volunteered Cobbett. "It's from a poem by Richard Wilbur, a damned unhappy poet." "Quotidian," repeated Laurel to herself. "That means something that keeps coming back, that returns daily," Cobbett said. "It's a term used to refer to a recurrent fever," added Pursuivant. Laurel and Cobbett sat down together on the bed. "I would say that for the time being we're safe here," declared Pursuivant. "Not at ease, but at least safe. At dawn, danger will go to sleep and we can open the door." "But why are we safe and nobody else?" Laurel cried out. "Why are we awake with everyone else in this town asleep and helpless?" "Apparently because we all of us wear garlic," replied Pursuivant patiently. "And because we ate garlic, plenty of it, at dinner time. And because there are crosses, crude but unmistakable, wherever something might try to come in. I won't ask you to be calm, but I'll ask you to be resolute." "I'm resolute," said Cobbett between clenched teeth. "I'm ready to go out there and face them." "If you did that, even with the garlic," said Pursuivant, you'd last about as long as a pint of whiskey and a 5-handed poker game. No, Lee, relax as much as you can, and let's talk." They talked, while outside strange presences could be felt rather than heard. The talk was of anything and everything, but where they were and why. Cobbett remembered strange things he had encountered in towns among mountains, along desolate roads, and what he'd been able to do about them. Pursuivant told of a vampire he had known and defeated in upstate New York, of a werewolf in his own southern countryside. Laurel, at Cobbett's urging, sang songs, old songs from her own rustic home place. Her voice was sweet. When she sang round as the ring, faces came and hung like smudges around the cross-cored windows. She saw and sang again, an old Appalachian carol called "Mary She Heard a Knock in the Night." The faces drifted away again, and the hours too drifted away one by one. Laurel should have been Appalachian. I'll do that in the future, which means doing horrible things are yours. Worse. The word worse should have 7 extra R's in it. "There's a horde of vampires on the night street here then." Cobbett at last brought up the subject of their problem. And they lull the people of Deslo to sleep to be helpless victims," agreed Pursuivant. "About this show, the land beyond the forest, mightn't it be welcomed as a chance to spread the infection? Even a town full of sleepers couldn't fade a growing community of blood drinkers." "If we could deal with the source, the original infection," began Cobbett. "The mistress of them, the queen," said Pursuivant. "Yes, the one whose walking by night rouses them all. If she could be destroyed, They'd all die properly. He glanced at the front window. The moonlight had a touch of slaty grey. Almost morning, he pronounced. Time for a visit to her tomb. I gave my promise I won't go there, said Cobbett. But I didn't promise, said Pursuivant, rising. You stay here with Laura. His silver blade in hand, he stepped out into darkness from which the moon had all but dropped away. Overhead, stars were fading out. Dawn was at hand. He sensed a flutter of movement on the far side of the street, an almost inaudible gibbering of sound. Steadily he walked across. He saw nothing along the sidework there, and heard nothing. Resolutely he tramped to the churchyard, his weapon poised. More greyness had come to dilute the dark. He pushed his way through the hedge of shrubs, stepped in among the grass, and paused at the edge of the grave. Above it hung an eddy of soft mist, no larger than the swirl of water draining from a sink. As Pursuivant watched it, it seemed to soak into the earth and disappear. That, he said to himself, is what a soul looks like when it seeks to regain its coffin. On he walked, step by weary, purposeful step, through the central crypt. A ray of the early sun, stealing between heavily leafed boughs, made his way more visible. In this dawn he would find what he would find. He knew that. The crypt's door of open bars was held shut by its heavy padlock. He examined that lock closely. After a moment he slid the point of his blade into the rusted keyhole and judiciously pressed this way, then that, and then back again the first way. The spring creakily relaxed and he dragged the door open. Holding his breath, he entered. The lid of the great stone vault was closed down. He took hold of the edge and heaved. The lid was heavy, but rose with a complaining grate of the hinges. Inside he saw a dark, closed coffin. He lifted the lid of that too. She lay there, calm-faced, and the eyes half shut as though dozing. Chastel, said Pursuivant to her. Not Gander. Chastel. The eyelids fluttered. That was all, but he knew that she had heard what he said. Now you can rest, he said. Rest in peace. Really in peace. He set the point of his silver blade at the swell of her left breast. Leaning both his broad hands upon the curved handle, he drove downwards with all his strength. She made a faint squeak of sound. Blood sprang up as he cleared his weapon. More light shone in. He could see a dark moisture fading from the blade like evaporating dew. In the coffin, Chastel's proud shape shriveled and darkened. Quickly he slammed the coffin shut, then lowered the lid of the vault in place, and then went quickly out. He pushed the door shut again and fastened the stubborn old lock. As he walked back through the churchyard among the graves, a bird twittered over his head. More distantly he heard the hum of a car's motor. The town was waking up. In the glowing radiance he walked back across the street. By now his steps were the steps of an old man, old and very tired. Inside Laurel's cabin, Laurel and Cobbett were stirring instant coffee into hot water in plastic cups. They questioned the judge with their tired eyes. She's finished, he said shortly. What will you tell Gander? Asked Cobbett. Chastel was Gander. But she was Gander, said Pursuivant again, sitting down. Chastel died. The infection weakened her out of her tomb, and she told people she was Gander, and naturally they believed her. He sighed wearily. Now that she's finished and at rest, those others, the ones she had bled, who also rose at night, will rest too. Laurel took a sip of coffee. Above the cup, her face was pale. Why do you say Why do you say Chastel was Gander? She asked the judge. How can you know that? I wondered from the very beginning. I was utterly sure just now. Sure? Said Laurel. How can you be sure? Pursuivant smiled at her with the very faintest of smiles. My dear, don't you think a man always recognizes a woman he has loved? He seemed to recover his characteristic defiant vigour. He rose and went to the door and put his hand on the knob. Now, if you'll just excuse me for a while. Don't you think we'd better hurry and leave? Cobbett asked him, before people miss her and ask questions. Not at all, said Pursuivant, his voice strong again. If we are gone, they'll ask questions about us too, possibly embarrassing questions. No, we'll stay. We'll eat a good breakfast, or at least pretend to eat it. And we'll be a surprise to the rest of them about the disappearance of their leading lady. I'll do my best, bowed Laura. I know you will, my child, said Pursuivant, and went out the door. That was Chastel, or Chastel, I don't know how you meant to pronounce it, by Manley Wellman. And so, before I go on to Der Untergang des Abendlandesmenschen, I will take a quick break. You should probably also take a quick break, stretch your legs, have a drink of water, hydrate, whatever else is appropriate. Take your meds if you've forgotten to do so. And I'll be back in about 5 minutes.
Unsettling.
There we go. I'm back. Having had a drink of something because my mouth has got to get really dry from reading. Okay. Reminder that this next one actually contains actual literal Nazis. I think it contains actual literal Hitler, if memory serves. And it's dealt with slightly frivolously. Content warnings. Okay. So this is Howard Waldrop's Der Untergang des Abendlandesmenschen. Der Untergang des Abendlandesmenschen. I vaguely remember that German grammar. Howard Waldrop stories are filled with images from contemporary American culture. Rock and roll music, bad science fiction movies, and real-life characters have all found their way into his uniquely comic/tragic fiction. Born in 1946 in Houston, Mississippi, the other one, I guess, Waldrop has lived in Texas since he was 4 years old. He won a Nebula Award for his story The Ugly Chicken, 1980, and his books include the novels The Texas-Israeli War, 1999, written with Jake Saunders, and Them Bones, along with such collections as Howard Who? All About Strange Monsters of the Recent Past, and Night of the Cooters, and more neat stories. His latest novel is titled The Moon World. The following story is typical Waldrop. Gem. In fairness, I was only gone 5 minutes, Gem, if you didn't have a chance to move. Did, in fact, skip entirely over Louisiana. They rode through the flickering landscape to the tune of organ music. Bronco Billy, short like a sailor, and William S., tall and rangy as a wind-blown pine. Their faces, their horses, the landscape all darkened and became light. Were at first indistinct, then sharp and clear as they rode across one ridge and down into the valley beyond. Ahead of them, in much darker shades, was the city of Bremen, Germany. Except for organ and piano music, it was quiet in most of Europe. In the vault below the opera in the City of Lights, Eric the Phantom played the toccata and fugue while the sewers ran blackly by. In Berlin, Cesare the Somnambulist slept. That is a hard word to say. His mentor, Caligari, lectured at the university and waited for his chance to send the monster through the streets. Also in Berlin, Dr. Mabuse was dead. Mabuse was dead and could no longer control the underworld. But in Bremen, something walked the night. To the cities of China eggs and dolls, in the time of sawdust bread and the price of 6 million marks for a postage stamp, came Bronco Billy and William S. They had ridden hard for 2 days and nights, and the horses were heavily lathered. They reined in and tied their mounts to a street lamp on the Wilhelmstrasse. "What say we get a drink, William S.?" said the short cigar boy. "All this damn flickering gives me a headache." William S. took a pose 3 feet from him and turned his head left and right, and then stepped up to the doors of the Gasthaus before them. Where am I? With his high-pointed hat and checked shirt, William S. looked like a weather-beaten scarecrow, or a child's version of Abraham Lincoln, before the beard. His eyes were like shiny glass, through which some inner hellfire showed. Bronco Billy hitched up his pants. He wore Levi's, which on him looked too large, and a dark vest, lighter shirt, big leather chaps, and 3 tassels at the hip, knee, and calf. His hat seemed 3 sizes too big. Inside the tavern, things were murky grey, black and stark white, and always the flickering. They sat down at the table and watched their clientele. Ex-soldiers in the remnants of uniform, 7 years after the Great War had ended. The unemployed, spending their last few coins on beer. The air was thick with grey smoke from pipes and cheap cigarettes. Not too many people had noticed the entrance of William S. and Bronco Billy. 2 had. "Quirt," said an American captain, his hand on his drinking buddy, a sergeant. "What?" asked the sergeant, his hand on the barmaid. "Look who's here." The sergeant peered across the haze of flickering great smoke when the cowboys sat. "Damn," he said. "Want to go over and chat with them?" asked the captain. Now, what's written here is a series of ampersand, percentage marks, and other signs, which I assume is supposed to be a swear word. So, "Fuck no," cursed the sergeant. "This ain't our fucking picture." "I suppose you're right," said the captain, returned to his wine. "You must remember, my friend," said William S. after the waiter brought the beer, "that there can be no rest in the pursuit of evil." "Yeah, but hell, William S., this is a long way from home." William S. lit a match, put it to a briar pipe containing his favourite shag tobacco. Shag. He puffed on it a few moments and then regarded his companion across his tankard. My dear Bronco Billy, he said, no place is too far to go in order to thwart the forces of darkness. This is something Dr. Helioglobulus could not handle by himself, else he should not have summoned us. Yeah, but William S., my butt sore is rising after 2 days in the saddle. I think we should bunk down before we see this doctor fellow. Ah, that's where you're wrong, my friend, said the tall hawk-nosed cowboy. Evil never sleeps. Man must. Well, I'm a man, said Bronco Billy. I say, let's sleep. Just then, Dr. Helioglobulus entered the tavern. That is a hard name to say. He was dressed as a Tyrolean mountain guide in lederhosen and feathered cap, climbing boots and suspenders. He carried with him an alpenstock, which made a large clunk each time it touched the floor. He walked through the flickering darkness and smoke and stood in front of the table with the 2 cowboys. William S. had ridden. Doctor, he began. Eulenspiegel, said the other, an admonitory finger to his lips. Bronco Billy rolled his eyes heavenward. Dr. Eulenspiegel, I'd like you to meet my associate and chronicler, Mr. Bronco Billy. The doctor clicked his heels together. Have a chair. No, he's doing a squeaky voice for him. Have a chair, said Bronco Billy, pushing one from under the table with his white boot. He tipped his hat above his eyes. The doctor, in his comic opera outfit, sat. Helioglobulus, whispered William S. Whatever are you up to? I had to come incognito. There are others who should not learn of my presence here. Bronco Billy looked from one to the other and rolled his eyes again. And the game is afoot? Asked William S., his eyes more alight than ever. Game such as man has never before seen, said the doctor. I'll see, said William S., his eyes narrowing as he drew on his pipe. Moriarty? Much more evil. More evil? Asked the cowboy, his fingertips pressed together. I cannot imagine such. Neither could I up until a week ago, said Helioglobulus. Since then the city has experienced wholesale terrors. Rats run the streets at night, in fate houses. The tavern will be deserted by nightfall. The people lock their doors and say prayers even in this age. They are reverting to the old superstitions. They have just cause, asked William S. A week ago, a ship pulled into the pier. On board was one man. He paused for dramatic effort. Bronco Billy was unimpressed. The doctor continued. The crew, the passengers were gone. Only the captain was aboard, lashed to the wheel, and he was drained of blood. Bronco Billy became interested. You mean, asked William S., bending over his beard, we are dealing with the undead? I am afraid so, said Dr. Helioglobulus, twisting his moustaches. Then we will need the proper armaments, said the tall cowboy. I have them, said the doctor, taking cartridge boxes from his backpack. Good, said William S. Bronco Billy, you have your revolver? What? What do you mean, do you have your revolver? Just what do you mean? Have you ever seen me without my guns, William S.? Are you losing your mind? Sorry, Billy, said William S., looking properly abashed. Take these, said Helioglobulus. Bronco and Billy broke open his 2 peacemakers, dumped the .45 shells on the table. William S. unlimbered his 2 Navy .36 and pushed the recoil rod down in the cylinders. That was a lot of gun words that I don't understand. He pushed each cartridge out onto the tabletop. Billy started to load up his pistols and took a closer look at the shells, held one up and examined it. Goddamn, William S. and wooden bullets! Wooden bullets! Helioglobulus was trying to wave him to silence. The tall cowboy tried to put his hand on the other. Everyone in the beer hall had turned him. There was a deafening silence. All the patrons turned towards their table. Damn, said Bronco Billy. You can't shoot wooden bullet 15 feet and expect to hear the broadside of a corn crib. Where the hell are we going to shoot wooden bullets at? The tavern began to empty, people rushing from the place, looking back in terror. All except 5 men at the far table. I'm afraid, my dear Bronco Billy, said Yes, that you have frightened the patrons and warned the evil ones of our presence. Bronco Billy looked round. You mean those guys over there? He nodded to the other man. Hell, William S., we both took on 12 men one time. Doing these stupid voices is doing my throat in. Dr. Helioglobulus sighed. No, you don't understand. Those men over there are harmless, crackpot revolutionists. William and I are speaking of Nosferatu. Bronco Billy continued to stare at him. The undead! No response. Vampires. You mean, asked Billy, like Thedabara? Not vamps, my dear friend, said the hot-nosed Brangler. Vampires. Those who rise from the dead and suck blood of the living. Oh, said Bronco Billy. Then he looked at the cartridges. These kill him? Theoretically, said Helioglobulus. Meaning you don't know? The doctor nodded. In that case, said Bronco Bill, we go half it. He began to load his 45s with one regular bullet, then one wooden one, then another standard. William S. had already filled his with wooden slugs. Excellent, said Helioglobulus. Now, put these over your hatbands. I hope you never have to get close enough for them to be effective. What he handed them were silver hatbands. Stamped on the shiny surface of the bands was a series of crosses. They slipped them on their heads, settling them on their hat rims. What next? Asked Bronco Billy. Why, we wait for nightfall, for the Nosferatu to strike, said the doctor. Did you hear them, Herman? Asked Joseph. Sure, you think we ought to do the same? Where would we find someone to make wooden bullets for pistols such as ours? Asked Joseph. The 5 men sitting at the table looked towards the doctor and the 2 cowboys. All 5 were dressed in the remnants of uniforms belonging to the war. The one addressed as Herman still wore the Knight's Cross on the faded splendour of his dress jacket. Martin, said Herman, do you know where we can get wooden bullets? I'm sure we could go and find someone to make them for automatics, he answered. Ernst, go to Wortsman, see about them. Ernst stood, then stopped the table. Every time I hear the word vampire, I reach for my Browning, he said. They all laughed. Martin, Herman, Joseph, Ernst, most of all. Even Adolf laughed a little. Soon after dark, someone ran into the place, white of face. The vampire! He yelled, pointing vaguely out into the street, and fell out. Bronco Billy and William S. jumped up. Helioglobulus stopped them. I'm too old, and I will only hold you up, he said. I should try to catch up later. Remember, the crosses! The bullets in the heart! As they rushed out past the other table, Ernst, who had left an hour earlier, returned with the 2 boxes. Quick, Joseph, he said as the 2 cowboys went through the door. Follow them. We'll be right behind. Your pistol. Joseph turned, threw a Browning automatic pistol back to Herman, then went out the door as hoofbeats clattered in the street. The other 4 began to load their pistols from the boxes of cartridges. The 2 cowboys rode towards the commotion. Yee-haw! Yelled Bronco Billy. They galloped down the well-paved streets, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the cobbles. They passed the police and others running towards the sound of screams and dying. Members of the Free Corps, ex-soldiers and students, swarmed the streets in their uniforms. Torches burned against the flickering black night skies. The city was trying to overcome the Nosferatu by force. Bronco Billy and William S. charged towards the fighting. In the centre of the square stood a coach, all covered in black crepe. The driver, a plump, cadaverous man, held the reins to fall-back horses. The 4 were rearing high in their traces, their hooves menacing the crowd. But it was not the horses which kept the mob back. Crawling out of a second-story hotel window was a vision from a nightmare. Bald, with pointed ears, teeth like a rat, beady eyes bright in the flickering night, the vampire climbed from a bedroom to the balcony. The front of his frock coat was covered with blood. Its face and arms were smeared. A man's hand stuck halfway out of the window, and the curtains were spattered black. The Nosferatu jumped to the ground, and the crowd parted as he leaped from the hotel steps to the waiting carriage. Then the driver cracked his whip over the horses. There was no sound, and the team charged, tumbling people like leaves before the night wind. The carriage seemed to float towards the cowboys, who rode after it. There was no sound of hoofbeats ahead, no noise from the harness, no creak of axles. It was as if they followed the wind itself through the nighttime streets of Bremen. They sped down the flickering main roads. Once when Bronco Billy glanced behind him, he thought he saw a motorcycle headlights following, but he devoted most of his attention to the fleeing coach. William S. rode beside him. They gained on the closed carriage. Bronco Billy drew his left-hand pistol. He was ambidextrous, and fired at the broad back of the driver. He heard the splintery clatter of the wooden bullet as it ricocheted off the coach. Then the carriage turned ahead of them. He was almost smashed against the garden wall by the headlong plunge of his mount. Then he recovered, leaning far over the saddle as if his horse were a sailboat and he a sailor, peeling against the wind. Then he and William S. were closing with the hearse on a long, broad stretch of the avenue. They pulled even with the driver, and for the first time the hackles rose on Bronco Billy's neck as he rode beside the black crepe coach. There was no sound but him, his horse, their gallop. He saw the black-garbed driver crack the long whip, heard no snap, heard no horses, heard no wheels. His heart in his throat, he watched William S. pull even on the other side. The driver turned that way, snapped his whip towards the taller cowboy. Bronco Billy saw his friend's hat fly away, cut in 2. Billy took careful aim and shot the led horse in the head twice. It dropped like a ton of cement, and the air was filled with a vicious, soundless image. 4 horses, the driver, the carriage, he, his mount, and William S. all flying through the air in a tangle. Then the side of the coach caught him, and the incessant flickering went out. He must have awakened a few seconds later. His horse was atop him, but he didn't think anything was broken. He pushed himself out from under it. The driver was staggering up from the flinders of the coach. Strange, thought Bronco Billy. Now I hear the sounds of the wheels turning, the screams of the dying horses. The driver pulled the knife. He started toward the cowboy. Bronco Billy found his right-hand pistol still in its holster. He pulled it, fired directly into the heart of the fat man. The driver folded from the recoil, then stood again. Billy pulled the trigger. The driver dropped as the wooden bullet turned his heart to giblets. Bronco Billy took out the regular ammo from his pistol and began to cram the wooden ones in. As he did, motorcycles came screaming to a stop beside him, and the 5 men from the tavern climbed from them or their sidecars. He looked around for William S., but he could not see him. Then he heard the shooting from the rooftop of the street. 12 shots, quick as summer thunder. One of William S.'s revolvers dropped 4 stories and hit the ground beside him. The Germans were already at the stairs ahead of Bronco Billy as he ran. When the carriage had crashed into them, William S. had been thrown clear. He jumped up in time to see the vampires run into the doorway of the residential block across the way. He tore after while the driver pulled himself from the wreckage and Bronco Billy was crawling from under his horse. Up the stairs he ran. He could now hear the pounding feet of the living dead man ahead, unlike the silence before the wreck. A flickering, murky hallway was before him, and he saw the door at the far end close. William S. smashed into it, rolled. He heard the scrape of teeth behind him and saw the rat-like face snap shut inches away. He came up, his pistols levelled at the vampire. The bald-headed thing grabbed the open door and pulled it before him. William S. stood, feet braced, a foot from the door, and began to fire into it. His Colt 36 inches from front of his face, he fired again and again to the wooden door, watching chunks and splinters shear away. He heard the vampire squeal like a rat trapped behind a trash can, and he fired until both pistols clicked dry. The door swung slowly awry, pieces of it hanging. The Nosferatu grinned and carefully pushed the door closed. It hissed and crouched. William S. reached up for his hat, and remembered that the driver had knocked it off his head before the collision. The thing leaped. One of his pistols was knocked over the parapet. Then he was fighting for his life. The 5 Germans, yelling to each other, slammed into the doorway at the end of the hall. From beyond, they heard the sounds of scuffling, laboured breathing, and the rip and tear of cloth. Bronco Billy charged up behind them. "The door, it's jammed," said one. "His hat!" yelled Bronco Billy. "He lost his hat!" "Hat?" asked the one called Joseph in English. "Why his hat?" The other shouldered against the gapped door. Through it they saw flashes of movement against the bright, flickering night sky. "Crosses!" yelled Bronco Billy. "Like this!" He pointed to his hatband. "Ah!" said Joseph. "Kreuzes!" He pulled something from the one called Adolf, who hung back a little, threw it through the hole in the door. "Kreuzen!" yelled Joseph. "The cross!" screamed Bronco Billy. "William S. the cross!" The sound of scuffling stopped. Joseph tossed his pistol through the opening. They continued to bang on the door. The thing had its talons on his throat when the yelling began. The vampire was strangling him. Little circles were swimming in his sight. He was down beneath the monster. It smelled of old dirt, raw meat, of death. Its rat eyes were bright with haste. With hate? No, with hate. Then he heard the yell. "A cross!" and something fluttered at the edge of his vision. He let go of one hand from his vampire and grabbed it up. It felt like cloth. He shoved it at the thing's face. Hands let go. William S. held the cloth before him, and as his breath came back in a rush, he staggered up and the Nosferatu put its hands over its face. He pushed towards it. Then the Browning automatic pistol landed beside his foot, and he heard noises at the door behind him. Holding the cloth, he picked up the pistol. The vampire hissed like a radiator. William S. aimed and fired. The pistol was fully automatic. The wooden bullets opened the vampire like a zipper coming off. The door crashed outwards, and the 5 Germans and Bronco Billy rushed through. William S. held to the door frame and caught his breath. A crowd was gathering below, at the sight of the wrecked hearse and the dead horses. Torchlights wobbled their reflections on the houses across the road. It looked like something from Dante. Helioglobulus came onto the roof, took one look at the vampire, and ran his alpenstock, handle first, into its ruined chest. "Just to make sure," he said. Bronco Billy was clapping him on the back. "Sure thought you'd gone to the last roundup," he said. The 5 Germans were busy with the vampire's corpse. William S. looked at the piece of cloth, still clenched tightly in his own hand. He opened it. It was an armband. On its red cloth was a white circle with a twisted black cross. Like the decorations the Indians used on their blankets, only in reverse. Actual literal Nazis. He looked at the Germans. 4 of them wore the armbands. The 5th, wearing an old corporal's uniform, had a torn sleeve. They were slipping a yellow armband over the arm of the vampire's coat. When they finished, they picked the thing up and carried it to the roof's edge. It looked like a spitted pig. The yellow armband had 2 interlocking triangles, like the device on the chest of the costumes William S. had worn when he played Ben-Hur on Broadway, the Star of David. The crowd below screamed as the corpse fell towards them. There were shouts, then The unemployed, the war-wounded, the young, the bitter, the disillusioned. Then the shouting stopped, and they began to chant. The 5 Germans stood on the parapet looking down at the milling people. They talked among themselves. Bronco Billy held William S. until he caught his breath. They heard the crowds disperse, fill in again, break, drift off, reform, reassemble, grow larger. "Well, pard," said Bronco Billy, "let's mosey over to a hotel and get some shut-eye." "That would be nice," said William S. Helioglobulus joined them. "We should go by the back way," he said. "I don't like the way this crowd is acting," said Bronco Billy. William S. walked to the parapet, looked over the city. Under the dark, flickering sky, there were other lights. Here and there, synagogues began to flicker, and then to burn. So yeah, that one was definitely a story. Yeah, well, sure was a story, that one. Content warnings. So many content warnings. Right. I am done for now. The next two, in 2 weeks' time, assuming I remember to do so and nothing else stops me, e.g. a LARP or anything like that, I will do E.F. Benson's The Room in the Tower and The Laird of Dunedin, in which case you can indeed hear me do a Scots accent again. After that, there are 3 or 4 stories left, but most of them are quite long ones, so after The Laird of Dunedin, I'll probably do them in batches of 1, that kind of thing, because Midnight Mass, which is still kind of anti-Semitic, but not quite, at least nicer than that one. Yellow Fog is very long, because that's Don Sebastian de... what's his name? Mr. Newcastle. Is one by a well-known character who appears in a lot of books by the same guy. And then there's Red Rain is the final one, before the Neil Gaiman poem, which is Kim Newman, who was a well-known film critic and also wrote a series of books, which is sort of like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, but with vampires, where there's lots of different characters from various different horror fictions, which he's obviously intimately familiar with. He turned it. This was first published in this book, and then he turned it into a full novel, and in fact a series of novels, which are quite good. Now apparently Bryn is streaming, so theoretically I could raid him, but I will have to work out how to do that. While I'm also, for some reason, the man has an absolutely preposterous username. So let's see if I can work out how to do raiding. Yeah, to be in fairness, Zoe, I was mainly switching between "Good morning, I'm from Texas," or "This is my approximation of being from Texas," and "Good morning, I am from Bremen." So for a limited number of accents I had to do with that one, rather than having to switch constantly between the series of different ones, all from the US, spiraling wildly from like Virginia to Texas and back up to Connecticut. I still do not know how to do a Connecticut accent. How the hell do you raid? You type something, don't you? Like raid. Let's try that. Raid channel. Turns out a lot of Twitch is just IRC with the serial numbers filed off. Okay. This channel is intended. There we go. Okay, yeah, we are raiding Bryn. Let's see what happens. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.